thank you all for being here today for our second installation of Voices of GIS. Today we are joined by my colleague and friend, Dr. Zachary Hoylman. Zach is the Assistant State Climatologist for the Montana Climate Office, which is based out of the College of Forestry here, and is an assistant research faculty member in the Department of Forest Management. Zach has been here at the university for a long time. He got his undergraduate degree in geosciences here and at University College Cork, in Ireland, and then stayed on for a doctorate in hydrology and forestry here at the university, and got that degree in 2018. I met Zach in 2017 when I started working at the Montana Climate Office, and he was finishing up his dissertation, and we got along great, famously from the beginning. Zach, as you know, is also sits on the Governor's Drought and Water Supply Committee, Drought Monitoring Subcommittee. It's a mouthful, and has created the tool that's used on a weekly basis to assess drought conditions here in the state of Montana, and has been for several years now. And so that's where our conversation's going to start.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, thank you all for having me. Excited to be here. And are you guys all forestry, or is it all forestry? No. NRSM, or what's the other, what other groups do we have here?
The old post-back.
The old post-back, sweet.
Wildlife bio.
Wildlife bio, okay. ESS. All right.
Yeah, we've got a couple of archaeologists in here.
Sweet.
Other graduate students in geography and other programs.
Cool.
And a lot of
group.
foresters as well.
Sweet.
Well, so the students all everybody submitted questions. I got great questions again. Thank you all so much. I've categorized them just like last time, and I want to start the conversation just talking about your career in preparation for the position that you're in right now. I gave a little bit of an overview from your bio sketch, but could you go into a little more detail about your career path? What brought you to being the assistant state climatologist, and how did you factor into that?
Yeah. Well, it's funny. I started actually. I thought I was going to be a composition major and play Latin jazz when I came to this university in 2010, and that was my total focus. And then I actually was up in the geosciences department, and my father used to be a groundwater hydrologist, so I was just interested in water, and went up and realized that I could spend all day staring at minerals in a mineralogy lab and go hike around in the woods and study rocks, and totally changed my path. So started with music and totally jumped to the other side to physical sciences. And then when I first started here, there was a program in the geology department called the International Field Geosciences program, which was a co-hosted undergraduate program through University College Cork in Ireland and University of Montana. And so my freshman year, I basically got to get integrated with this group of then juniors from University College Cork. And my advisor at the time, Dr. Hendricks, basically was like, hey, we've got some money, do you want to go to Ireland? The only catch is that you're supposed to be a senior and you're only a freshman. So I said yes, of course, and they threw me into a bunch of 400 level classes. I went out to Dillon, did a month-long field mapping, geologic field mapping program out there, and then got shipped to Ireland, which as a 19-year-old, as you can all imagine, was awesome, super awesome, and totally different than what I had experienced here. And as part of that program, there was a big component of it where I was actually in Germany. And in Germany, that's where I cut my teeth on GIS, and I did a GIS program at University of Potsdam near Berlin. It's in Potsdam. And there I did a month-long program where I was learning kind of about traditional GIS, using mostly Esri, ARC type systems, and using everything within graphical user interfaces, which I assume you guys are super familiar with at this point, doing point and click, that kind of stuff. Then I came back from my undergrad, finished up my degree here at the U, and started doing some work out at Lubrecht just for undergraduate project that then transitioned into an NSF program. And my advisor at the time, Kelsey Genso, then took me on as a master's student, and we hit an NSF project, which then allowed me to have several years of funding to do a PhD program. So I just went straight from a master's program in my first semester and just pivoted straight to a PhD. And within that PhD program, as I'm sure many of you are experiencing, I was doing a bunch of stuff in ARC, trying to do a bunch of mapping and data analytics, and I started to get just bogged down by the point and click, not being able to do what I wanted. And I had zero programming skills, never had written a script in my life, except for a little bit with another faculty member in geosciences. And through that experience, I started to use ArcPy, which is the Python bone of ARC, effectively. Started programming in there, and then from there kind of took off and went in a totally different direction of programmatic GIS. So I won't go into that yet, because I'm sure we probably will later on, but yeah, that was my trajectory, basically starting as an undergrad, doing geology, mapping, literally going out and drawing maps with topo basically backgrounds, and drawing geologic contacts just out in Dillon, Montana, 20 miles away from a road, just sitting up on an outcrop, and started there with mapping. Went into digitizing those maps, went to Germany to learn how to do my GIS certificate, came back, started a master's program, turned into a PhD, and started doing a lot more analytics as opposed to just the cartography.
And you mentioned programming as a skill that you sort of gained in your graduate work. What are there other skills that weren't part of your sort of initial foray into GIS that maybe you wish you had done when you first started GIS, or that you feel are essential now to what you do?
Yeah.
That would help students have some direction.
Yeah, so how many of you are doing the GIS certificate? Basically everyone. Okay, so that's the one thing I would have done, 100%, because I came into this program and started my PhD work without even understanding, like beyond that GIS certificate that I did in Germany, that was a fast track thing, that didn't really get into theory or kind of like cartographic skills, but understanding coordinate reference systems, geographic reference systems, how projections work, the just kind of conceptual problem of taking an orb and putting it onto a flat piece of paper, all the distortions that go into that, understanding those kind of fundamentals was something I lacked, and I really had to play catch up in my graduate work. So I think what you guys are doing right now to get those fundamental skills are key. And then really recognizing the value of using GUIs and like Esri type systems when they're really applicable, and the value that they provide for easy data import, easy visualization, zooming around, zonal stats, buffering, all of these types of things, but understanding when those skills within like a graphical user interface just aren't efficient anymore. And being okay with saying, okay, this skill that I have that I'm comfortable with isn't the right tool for this next step in my kind of trajectory, and moving in that, and realizing that the information and the understanding that you learn from working in Esri is mappable to programming, and learning when that transition is really necessary. So
we'll get into some of the technologies that you've had to deploy that really go beyond what's available in ArcGIS.
Right.
A little bit later, but the students, Chris wrote in and asked, what does your day-to-day look like as Montana's assistant state climatologist? People are just interested in that title, what you do. Yeah. What does it look like functionally?
Yeah, so it's kind of like I've got like an academic title, which is a research professor in the Department of Forest Management, but then within the Montana Climate Office, I've definitely got more of a service title, which is this state climatologist, assistant state climatologist position. And first and foremost, it's to support my boss, Kelsey, who's the state climatologist, right? I mean, that's a big part of that service component. But secondly, it's really it's a whole suite of things. I mean, I'll get email requests from an engineer from Utah who's been basically tasked with creating a new lawn or big field system for the Yellowstone Club, and they need to know how much irrigation they should apply, how much water they should apply to this lawn to basically like optimize their irrigation systems. And they're like, hey, I don't even know how much I should expect evaporation to occur on this plot of land, right? So that's like one thing where I'll go in and I'll build climatologies of things like reference evapotranspiration, which represents how much water might be evaporated from a well-watered surface like a lawn, and taking that kind of knowledge of the basic science, but then applying it within like a GIS. I do it in a programmatic way, but it's the same thing, right? Mm-hmm. Taking a GIS perspective to basically quantify those needs and then say, hey, you need to irrigate 30 inches a year, and this is how you might do it over the season. So that's one type of request. The other one that I think we're going to get into later is really this service to the state for providing, like I was saying, kind of the authoritative drought information for the state. Mm-hmm. And if you guys weren't aware, drought is obviously something that's really impactful to Montana. Is anyone here from the High Line or from Eastern Montana? Come from an agricultural background? No. That's fine. It's fine. But it might be surprising for you to know that drought assessments are responsible for, in Montana alone, there's one program that's called the Livestock Forage Program, and in Montana alone, it represents hundreds of millions of dollars in disaster relief to producers this was over a 10-year period, but it could be, tens to even maybe $100 million a year, depending on how severe a drought event is. Mm-hmm. And those funds are only available to producers, agricultural folks right across the state that are producing winter wheat, that are producing alfalfa for livestock feed, etc. That is only available to them under this pretense of a disaster declaration, which is triggered by this kind of basically drought mapping. And so I won't go into too many details there, but that's a huge component of my job. Is basically, as Kyle was saying, I built a system to basically do that interactive drought mapping online through an online GIS web portal. I use something called Leaflet, which is basically like a web-based anytime you're looking at, say, Google Maps, or you're looking at like Apple Maps or something like that, they all use kind of proprietary different mapping systems, but they're all very similar, and that's what Leaflet is, right? It's just an interactive way of providing GIS information online to anybody given a URL, right? And so that's a huge part of my job, is maintaining that database. We calculate literally hundreds of maps every day based on, 40,000 layers of precipitation and reference evapotranspiration, daily data that's all gridded across the country. I bring in data sets from SNOWTEL, point data sets, so not only raster gridded data, but vector data, and put that all together into one cohesive unit that then is used for our drought assessment. And what I'm sure you guys are probably already know and are going to learn throughout your careers, that just because the way that maybe I designed a mapping system that seems perfect to me. When you give it to someone else, they're going to be like, this is crap. You did not create this in a way that's usable for me. So there's a whole lot of exchange between the Governor's Drought and Water Supply Advisory Committee and the technical subcommittee to say, hey, this doesn't make sense. I don't understand why you chose this. You should change it to that. People at DNRC are constantly emailing me to make changes, so there's a lot of maintenance to that type of stuff.
And just to be clear, you wrote programs to automate the creation of all those layers. Right. It's not like you spend every hour of your waking day creating those maps. No, so every day, a whole suite. It's roughly 200 maps that get generated every single day, and that gets processed. Basically, it starts at 11 p.m. and then it'll chug until 3 a.m. And every day there's just 4 hours on one of our servers in the climate office that's calculating all these metrics programmatically through R, through Python, and then displaying them using other systems like JavaScript to basically do the web delivery. So let's pivot to that drought dashboard. Everybody here has gotten to peruse it, to look at it. We had people write in and say, there's just a ton here.
Yeah.
And that gets to that processing that happens every night. But what's not clear on that dashboard is the story behind it.
Yeah.
Why did we need that
Yeah.
dashboard, that authoritative resource for
Yeah.
drought assessment?
Yeah, that's a great. So none of you are from agricultural families, but back in 2017, I don't know if you guys were in Montana at that time, but we had a really extreme, what we call flash drought event, which was a type of drought event that drought scientists love to slice and dice and create new names and coin new terms because it helps you get published in Nature and all that. But regardless, a flash drought is just a drought that occurs really quickly, and it often is associated with heavy winds, really hot temperatures, lots of evapotranspiration, obviously lacks of precipitation. And what happened was in 2017, that flash drought came in and just blitzed the high line, so the whole basically north central portion of Montana going down into the northeast, and really just obliterated the crops and the livestock feed in that whole region. And it was a hugely painful event for many people in Montana, and it caused huge economic losses for folks. Mm-hmm. And it was a really bad event. And to be quite frank, the drought monitoring process in Montana was not equipped to basically make those kinds of assessments in the way that we needed to, with the rapidity that we needed to. And given that event, this was before I was even with the Governor's Drought and Water Supply Advisory Committee at all. They basically realized this and said, okay, we need to make changes. We need better data sets. We need more collaboration. We need experts from across the state to be chiming in this drought process. And beyond all that, we just need a place where we can go to actually analyze data sets that are there every single day, that are coming from a reputable source, that are scientifically vetted in a way that breeds confidence in their usage, right? And so in that light, basically, Kelsey, my boss, along with others from DNRC, folks like Michael Downey at DNRC, and folks from the Forest Service like Zach Holden, got together and wrote a proposal to NOAA to basically create this system. And so then it was a good time for me to graduate my PhD program, because there was this new project that needed someone to kind of dive in. My PhD was all about watershed hydrology and trees. Like, I was up just hiking around up in the woods, taking cores of trees, literally hitting in wells with sledgehammers and measuring water tables, and then using remote sensing, a lot of satellite information, to scale those results. Mm-hmm. And I had never done anything like this before. And Kelsey, Kyle, and others were basically like, it's all good, you got it, go for it. And just let me kind of run. And I went through many different iterations of building this dashboard, which wasn't even a dashboard at that time. I was using antiquated systems to basically to display that data, things that just didn't work well. And through a series of iterations of development, created the dashboard, which is now, we just released a new version of it like 3 months ago. Mm-hmm. So it's constantly being updated and has now been codified. An interesting tidbit, that Montana hadn't updated their drought management plan since 1995, which is like crazy in a lot of ways, because that's 30 years, and a lot's changed in 30 years. And so this year we finally rewrote our drought management plan. I think it was released back in November, so 2023. And in that document, not only did Kelsey and I write a big section of that document, the drought dashboard and the code base behind it was codified as the authoritative source of drought information across the state. So not only is it, just something that we provide, but it's also been codified into kind of state documentation,
state
policy as ways to do it. So it was a growing process, but it really came out of this one event that kind of triggered this need to like rethink the way that we do things and the way that we provide information to scientists and concerned parties across Montana.
So, and you said there's hundreds of maps. I mean, you go into it and you start clicking through, and it can be a little overwhelming for a user.
Yeah.
And I've got two questions about this. The first question is, how much of that stems from the way that drought assessment was done before? I've heard you tell it where people would just bring their own data to the table every week and say, no, but my data says PDSI is this and so on. How much of it is just built from everything that people were bringing to the table anyway, versus how much of it was decision making that that you made or that was science backed?
Yeah. So it's a little bit of both for sure. So drought science is there's some things that frustrate me about drought science from a conceptual standpoint, because there's a lot of subjectivity built into the way that we do drought assessments, and historically has been the case of, hey, this, like something like a precipitation anomaly over the last 30 days or 60 days seems to align with impacts that I've heard people talk about on the ground. And that's the kind of thing that then is like, okay, well then we're going to use this 60-day precipitation anomaly to just map conditions across the state. And that was just kind of like a perspective that was just brought in, indoctrinated into this drought kind of community. And so, before we had the ability to do some of our own basic science to start vetting these products, which I'll talk about in a second, basically we wanted to start with a starting place, which was, these are the data sets that are used weekly within this national drought mapping system called the U.S. Drought Monitor, which is a national framework for mapping drought. And they use 30-day, 60-day, 90-day SPI. They use PDSI. They use this stream flow indicator. All these acronyms, acronym soup, right? That really just describe things like precipitation anomalies, temperature anomalies, the amount of evaporation that's occurring, vegetation stress, these kinds of things, right? And so we wanted to start by providing all of that information in one place, because that's what was needed to start this conversation.
And that's what people were used to.
And that's what people are used to.
Right.
And then we started our process of basically saying, okay, but we have all this data, that's great. But in a way, like I'm sure you guys recognize, having too much data in one spot actually doesn't make it more useful. It can actually make it less useful, because you're just like, I don't know what I'm even looking at here. And so now we're in this process of basically doing basic science, which is saying something like, okay, I'm really interested in soil moisture. Which precipitation anomaly, 30, 60, 90, 180 days, is most correlated or best representative of soil moisture dynamics? That way we can do an analysis and say, okay, it's actually 30-day SPI that we should be focusing on in this type part of the season, or maybe this other metric is a better proxy for soil moisture, or hey, maybe when we're really worried about soil moisture, we should just be using a soil moisture model itself. Other GIS frameworks, right, that actually drive physical hydrological models to say this is what soil moisture looks like, not use precipitation anomalies as proxies. So we're starting at this point to basically educate and try to create a system that we consider co-production, which is basically doing the science but then bringing it to producers in a way that we can describe to them why it's better, we can show to them with data why it's better, and then try to get people to incorporate these new data sets and more accurate kind of ways of analyzing drought into their practice. And that is a process that takes a really long time, because everyone is comfortable with what they've done for 5 years, 10 years, and who is this ivory tower scientist coming in telling me that I should change how I do drought just fine, right? And trying to basically change that narrative to, no, I respect that, you can still have these data, we should be using them too, but really these ones are much more accurate, and we are no longer in the early 2000s, we're now in the mid 2020s, and we have new tools and they're better and we can use them. For example, things like satellite information. That was something that we literally never had. How many of you guys have met or heard of Steve Running? Have any of you? Yeah? So Steve Running is a professor emeritus now in the Forestry department, but he literally launched probably the largest global ecological experiment ever, called MODIS, and MODIS is a satellite group, right? 2 satellites Aqua and Terra, that are going around the Earth. They're actually about to die, which is sad. But they've had a 25-year legacy of literally changing the world of ecology completely. And that launched in 2001. So we literally didn't have this kind of information, 20 years ago. Nor do we have the compute power to be able to use it. So he would tell me, literally, they would sit and they would get a new MODIS image that is just some random part of North America or Asia or wherever, and they would watch the pixels load across the screen. And literally, when they said that the first image came all the way through and they could see it, they were just like, oh my God. This is transformative, and it really was. And that's I think a representation of this new world of GIS that we're in now, that is big data, remote sensing, satellite information, that is something that no other generation has had access to. And it's on us, the next generation of GIS scientists, to really push that and say, yes, we have these old tools, they're still useful, but now we can literally look at the entire globe from space. And that gives us a whole different perspective on things that we have to leverage and we have to acknowledge as being a fundamentally different thing, right? And so I kind of got off track.
Well, complementary to our in situ measurements that people were using.
Absolutely.
I mean, if you've got a farmer and he says, I've got a rain gauge and I've gotten no rain in 3 months, you need to bring that to the bank.
Right.
And you've learned that time and time again
Yes.
when you talk to people across the state. But at the same time, bringing these other technologies that allow us to take that local knowledge and distribute it across a landscape has been pretty powerful.
Yeah, and just finishing that thought, I encourage you guys, we have a great office on campus. And I don't know if this is a part of your interview, but NTSG. Yeah, so John Kimball and NTSG, the Numeric Terradynamic Simulation Group. This was Steve Running's brainchild. He created this and part of MODIS, right? And NASA and the U of M are interlinked in a lot of ways. We literally, the first fiber optic cables in Montana, I'm pretty sure, got run to U of M because of NASA and because of NTSG. And this office on campus it's over in ISB, which is the Interdisciplinary Sciences Building, just to the west of us right now, is an awesome place to see incredible cutting edge science being done in collaboration with NASA. And that is, we're lucky enough to work with them, and it's just a really cool resource and a really cool legacy that U of M can really hold, and the GIS program at U of M can really hold up as something that U of M did change the world in the way that we did ecosystem science. And that's sounds kind of hyperbolic or whatever, hyperbole, but it really isn't. It's true. And so this is a really cool place to do GIS in a lot of ways, but simply just with that legacy. Go to the 4th floor of the Clap building and go to the Terra room. That whole room is just full of NASA posters and old newspapers of Steve Running, launching these probes, not knowing if it was going to work. And that really did change the world. So it's a cool thing that U of M has that no other organization. Other organizations can have similar stories, but we have a really special piece of that history, which is cool.
It's been so impactful, and you were talking about some of the impacts that just the drought work has on a weekly basis. Can you dive into that just a little bit more? It's a big decision. I talked about your research, our research on the importance of that reference period in determining drought, and part of that was explaining how D2, how severe drought and that drought monitor classification, just switching to that can trigger a ton of assistance. So it's sort of a burdensome decision, right?
Yeah.
What's the procedure that you and this group go through to make that decision, bring together all this information? And then I've got follow-up questions about how does that play? Do you ever get pushback?
Oh yeah. Yes, absolutely. As many of you probably can imagine, drought is a super contentious topic. It is something that, especially when you start bringing climate change into the drought conversation, things get really can get fiery, and there's a lot of reasons for that. I think the base of it is like you were saying, the way that we define drought is within this kind of statistical framework that is somewhat divorced from impact. It's completely related to the probability of observing an event, and a lot of drought scientists don't like to talk about it this way because it feels uncomfortable for some reason, but it's really, the way that we talk about drought is very similar to the way we talk about floods in terms of like a 1 in 500 year event or a 1 in 100 year event, right? And when we think about those types of events, especially in floods, there's huge implications for, you can imagine if you're an engineer and you're building a dam and you are trying to figure out how much water is going to flow into this dam so that it doesn't break and like destroy a community downstream. It matters a whole lot if you are misclassifying something that may be a 1 in 500 year event or maybe a 1 in 50 year event, right? Because that's going to completely change the way you design this physical structure to create kind of a risk buffering kind of system, right? And there's a really famous paper back in 2008 by this guy, Chris Milley, who really highlighted this and was like, what we mean by a 1 in 500 year event is changing. And that has huge implications for our water resource management, especially when we're talking about, he was really focused on the flood side of things, like thinking about infrastructure and the durability of infrastructure given these increases in extremes that we've been seeing with climate change. And the same kind of idea goes with drought classifications, because as climate change kind of slowly marches on, what we mean by drought needs to change, or else we will go into a system where we're maybe always in drought. For example, if you look at things that are happening places like the Southwest, where they've been in extreme drought conditions, right, for 20 years, right? At some point, that no longer becomes a drought. That is now a new normal. And it could still be classified as drought on different timescales. For example, there's a whole lot in the press about how it's a mega drought. And that's true from the perspective of the last 5,000 years or so, right? Or 1,200 years for that paper, suggesting that this is as bad as conditions have ever been in 1,200 years. That is totally relevant and true. But that isn't the way that we make decisions about our agricultural risk and the way that we are buffering our risk or making decisions associated with how likely we are to experience that 1 in 500 year event or that 1 in 100 year event, right? If we're designing our agriculture to withstand a 1 in 100 year event, 1 every 100 years, and it's happening 10 every 100 years, right? That requires a different way of thinking about the way that we're actually designing our system. So drought science goes, because of the way that we've framed it from this purely statistical standpoint and divorcing it from impacts to a certain degree. We do account for impacts in certain ways, but that really has, that can put drought scientists at odds with communities that are experiencing loss from drought, because we're speaking different languages, right? Like if you had a farm that had been in your family for 100 years and you were doing the same thing that your great-great-grandfather was doing back then, there's like there's a legacy behind those decisions that are personal, that are, knowledgeable, yeah, and go beyond, are totally different than a scientist that's coming in and looking at precipitation patterns and saying, hey, this actually isn't as bad as you think it is, and things are actually going to get quite a bit worse potentially into the future, so you need to make changes. So there's these two different kind of like worlds of drought that need to interact and are reliant on one another, but can often cause kind of conflict between the two, because sometimes we're not speaking the same language, we're not talking about the same reference periods, the same experiential references, right? And so there's that, you were asking about whether or not that causes contention, it certainly does.
Yeah.
We will get phone calls, and we actually welcome it because it tells us there's some places, right, where we're just missing the ball. Like the 2017 drought example, right?
Mm-hmm.
We totally missed that drought, and people were calling in being like, hey, you guys are crazy. Like, why aren't you seeing this? We need help. We need relief. And that's real. Those are real consequences of something that we didn't recognize. And so we create systems, both from email systems like listservs to allow people to provide input. We have what's called the Montana Drought Impacts Reporter, which is an online forum that allows people to submit information about what's happening. That all goes into a GIS framework and within the drought dashboard to kind of like to create that kind of coalescence of all that information. And then we also like have Zoom calls where we're going to targeted locations, you know, near Sydney, Montana, near the CMR, near Garfield County, wherever, where we're concerned about things, and people can chime in and tell us that we're doing things wrong. And that's usually the way it goes, right? Like,
yeah.
People aren't telling you you're doing things right because they're just trying to get their job done, and they're, you know, they don't have time for that, which I get. They have time to tell you when you're wrong, so that's a good thing. We need that.
The opposite happens though too. I mean, I'm thinking of the Flathead experience from this last summer, where you being the drought monitoring committee saw things that occurred that didn't match with the perception of people not living in that area of Montana, not living in northwest Montana, and also caused some political consternation.
Issues. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So there's you know, there's a lot of layers to drought science, and that's why I think it's so interesting. Like I was saying, there's things I don't like about it, the subjectivity, but that personal aspect of drought and that societal impact makes it both really important because we're actually talking about real people. Like, you know, in science, often at the end of like a talk, like if you've ever gone to a master's presentation or a PhD, you know, dissertation defense or something, someone goes, what are the broader impacts of your research? Like, I didn't quite get it. You know, you're talking about chlorophyll and this specific type of plant and how it responds to this light spectra. And there's like, you know, oftentimes there is really important broader impacts to that research, but it can feel kind of like, it's hard to like understand it at a personal level. And I think that drought is different because it is so impactful to people. And how many of you guys fish? How many of you guys ski? Like this year, skiing was pretty bad, right? That's a problem, right? And fishing next year, I'm like real worried. That's like my thing. That's what I do. I go raft and I fish and I backcountry ski and I hunt, and all of those activities are severely impacted by drought. And so there's a lot there, but yeah.
Yeah, you know, we're looking at a challenging.
We're looking at a challenging year. Yeah.
Well, I've got, you know, our last section is sort of advice. It's your advice for students and that sort of thing. I want to ask just one of these questions that has to do with open source software, since we were talking about it, and then open it up for some questions from others. But Aiden and Jeremiah both submitted very similar questions about open source software. And the question was, can you sort of elaborate on, from your perspective, on the advantages and challenges of using open source tools? Since you've had experience in using Esri software, you've had experience doing lots of different open source work. In creating the types of cutting edge geospatial applications that you create, what are the advantages and pitfalls that you've seen?
Yeah. Well, one of the advantages I would say is how many people have like $5,000 just lying around to like buy an Esri license, right? That's the obvious one. We don't have that kind of. I don't have that kind of money. I'm not. But there's other tools like QGIS. I don't know if you guys have explored Quantum, but this is an open source piece of software. It performs very similarly. It might not perform perfectly because there's people like me that are like literally writing that code to like do it as a pet project. So it's hugely powerful open source software because A, it's typically free, B, it's typically quite cutting edge because it's all these nerds that are just like doing it for fun and are generating all this code simply to like pursue this new idea, to pursue this new mechanism that's going to help them in their workflow, but they see how it's going to help other people. And so you're often, when you're using open source science, you're often at that kind of cutting edge, because that's, a lot of us scientists are pushing this idea of open science and this idea of open code. And, a key fundamental piece of science is reproducibility. And there's a huge problem in historical science of reproducibility, because how do you reproduce something that someone's written down? What are you gonna take pictures of all their equations as they're writing them down? And there's all these issues. But now we have code where we can create a version control system, like using Git or whatever, and you can look at my code, vet it, see what you think you disagree with, and then it has this whole layer of transparency to science that was never really there before. So there's huge benefits to that, because it's cutting edge, and oftentimes you're able to kind of apply these new methods quickly and easily. The downsides of it is that it's the cutting edge, and that it's new science, and people have not thought of every end case of how their algorithm might perform in different situations, which break and don't work well. So when you pay for something like Esri, you're paying for that rock solid, these are super vetted systems that are used at professional levels and are not are going to be able to handle what they throw at you, but it might be kind of limited what you can do. Whereas the other side of that spectrum is you can do anything you want, but you might be doing quite a bit of troubleshooting to figure out how to get it to actually work.
Yeah.
So there's huge kind of trade-offs in that perspective. But for me, I started programming in ArcPy, and then transitioned over to MATLAB because someone in my lab was using MATLAB. And then I wanted it on my personal computer, and it was oh, you need a $2,000 license every year. And it's okay, well, not going to use MATLAB anymore. So then I switched over to R, and I switched over to Python, and I switched over to JavaScript. And now all those are open source. They're all free. You just go on, download them. I started using QGIS instead of Esri to do quick gut checks. If you still, even when I generate a grid, a raster, or a vector or something of all this complex data that I wrote a bunch of code to do, I'll still open it up periodically in a Q portal just to take a look at it, make sure it looks right. But now you don't even really need to do that now, because we've got these systems in R and Python and other programming languages that allow you just to display it in your web browser. So it's boom, you don't even need Q anymore. Yeah. It's all there. But again, there's no perfect tool for every. There's no single tool to do everything, and that's one thing that I wish I recognized earlier on. A lot of people, and I'm kind of going on a tangent here, but a lot of people will be this programming language is the one to rule them all. This one is because industry uses this, or scientists use R, and it's not scalable or whatever. And one thing I wish I had heard at your guys' stage is that is not true. There's no one tool to rule them all. There are many different tools. You wouldn't use a hammer to screw in a screw. It's just not true. And no matter how much people try to sell it, it's not true. So it's totally worth your time to invest in learning a whole bunch of suite of tools, maybe specialize in one, but learning a whole bunch of ways to do things using different tools is hugely powerful, because every group you go to in your career, every company, every research enterprise, every whatever is going to have their own flavor of things, and there's no right or wrong way to do it. And open source is a huge piece of that, because it allows us to just try. We can just try Python. We can do a project on machine learning and artificial intelligence in Python. But I really like the way that I can manipulate rasters in R. But it doesn't really do that well for web delivery, so I have to use JavaScript to do that. Or maybe I just want to quickly analyze this grid. I'm going to use Q, or I'm going to use Esri because I have a license for it, and I can just open it up and play with it, right? So there's huge benefits to that, but it also is time intensive. But if you're going to be a technician in GIS, or maybe a scientist in the future, if you decide to go after a master's or a PhD, all of these tools are just going to help you in the long run, and they all it sounds totally weird, but it totally like stretches your brain in different ways, and you learn different ways of thinking about things just by trying different tools.
Yeah, well, and you train yourself to be agile.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm hearing you say is
Yeah.
that in terms of critical skill sets for a future GIS practitioner,
Yeah.
I'm hearing you say agility
Is key.
is key.
Is key. There's
Yeah.
no one tool. It's more about conceptualizing what your problem is, how you're going to get it done, and then figure out a tool that's going to help you get there in an easy way, right? And it's not about the specific program or the specific language or the specific GUI or the specific anything. It's all about learning how to think about workflows, and that's the key to GIS science in my perspective.
Well, thank you. I want to open it up. We've
Cool.
got about 5 more minutes. I did better than last time, everybody. Let's have a question. Who's got a question for Zach? And I didn't get to all of the questions that you all submitted, so I know that people have questions that I didn't get to. Jack.
So when you're working with your data for like the climate office, do you have it all stored in like a geodatabase, or is that like done in R or any of your coding at all?
Yeah, you know that there's typically I don't really use geodatabases too frequently, but we do use other types of data sets like geotiffs, for example. You can have nested geotiffs or raster stacks. We use file formats like netcdfs, and I don't know if you've ever been exposed to this concept, but you can actually have, you know, oftentimes we think of a grid as 2 dimensions, right? And then you could have 3 dimensions being time, so then you have a stack of grids, right? Maybe like daily precipitation. But then you can imagine if you had all that precipitation data and then you had temperature data as well, you can put it into a 4-dimensional grid that's called a hypercube, and you could have 4 dimensions, right? Which is lat, long, value of time, and then variable. And then you could build off of that even bigger and bigger. You could have 5 dimensions, you have 6, you could have infinite dimensions of data, right? So typically we'll work with, like a lot of the stuff that I do with the meteorological data, calculating precipitation of normal, those are remote data sets that are generated by University of Idaho, University of Merced, these other entities that host them as basically databases that are hosting data as netcdfs or whatever file format, and then we pull them in R or Python and manipulate them. I didn't even talk about Earth Engine. We use a lot of Google Earth Engine, which is a planetary scale system to basically analyze all that MODIS data that I was talking about with Steve running. Like, we don't, that's terabytes to petabytes of data. You can't put that on a computer. You need a Google Cloud to handle that. So the answer is probably not super satisfying, but we use lots of different types of ways to store data. And then when you're talking about even web delivery, there's specific ways to store rasters, like as cloud optimized geotiffs, or vectors as this format called flat geobuffs that allow you to basically interact with these data in more efficient ways depending on the application. So it's a mixed bag, but there's lots of ways to do it. Mostly remote these days though. Data isn't usually, like, we store a lot of data on hard drives, but mainly just for like analytics that we're doing, like for a paper or a research or something like that. When we're doing like these kinds of like operational data sets, they're usually remote.
Got time for one more.
To what degree do you like communicate and interact with like the DNRC for like planning for fire season and stuff like that?
Yeah, it's a good question. We do some. The drought work definitely impacts fire preparedness and the way that basically fire chiefs across the state are like allocating resources or prepared to allocate resources. But there's a whole different system for mapping fire risk and fire spread that is usually done through the Forest Service. There's like a whole system called I'm forgetting. I can't remember the acronym, but there's a system that my colleague like Zach Holden works with the Forest Service specifically. He's a Forest Service research scientist and produces a similar type of database. You can think of like like a drought dashboard, but instead it's all for fire preparedness. And those variables are different, right? Wind speed, relative humidity, something that's like pressure at 500 millibars, which is something that's like an atmospheric variable that helps predict fire behavior. So I do interact with them, but it's more from like this tangential, like drought clearly impacts fire behavior, but they've got more specified tools. But it might be like, oh, we're concerned about the High Line, we're concerned about, Cascade County, and so we're gonna like really be ready to prepare, we're gonna have crews ready to go. But then they might use a different tool to like, once a fire's ignited. One thing that we do quite a bit of, and more in research, is use satellite information to understand the spatial distribution of ignitions. So you can use MODIS data, or other data sets that are more frequent in their overlay in the way that they kind of return data, to basically say, oh, there was a lightning strike in, Roaring Lion on the Bitterroot or something like that. And we oftentimes use that data and relay that to fire managers about where fires occurred. And then smoke, we use the GOES satellite, which is another satellite to really understand how smoke is moving across systems, how there might be, pockets of inversion, like in the Missoula Valley, that trap a bunch of smoke. You can literally see that from space. So those kinds of things, but it's less related to fire.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks.